The plotting room aboard USS West Virginia was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft green glow of the radar screen. It was 3:16 in the morning on October 25, 1944. The air inside the armoured citadel smelled of oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of electrical equipment running at full capacity. Outside, the Surigao Strait was utterly black. No moon, no stars. Just darkness so complete that men on deck could not see their hands in front of their faces. Seaman First Class Richard Borkowski stared at his Mark 8 radar display, watching the sweeping arm paint green phosphorescent returns across the circular screen. He had been tracking the same contacts for 14 minutes now, watching them grow larger, sharper, more defined with each sweep. At a range of 42,000 yards, nearly 24 miles, the returns had been faint, ghostly. Now, at 38,000 yards, they were unmistakable. Ships. Large ships. Moving north through the part, straight at approximately 20 knots. Range 38000, Borkowski reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Bearing 020. Multiple contacts. Speed 2 to 0 knots. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Howard Vestal, the ship's gunnery officer, leaned over the plotting table. The Mark 8 rangekeeper, an analog computer the size of a refrigerator, filled with gears, cams, and electric motors, was already humming with activity. Operators fed in data, wind speed, air temperature, powder temperature, the ship's own course and speed. The machine calculated, its mechanical brain solving differential equations that would have taken a human mathematician hours to work through. It computed where the target would be when the shells arrived. It calculated the trajectory of projectiles that would arc through the darkness at supersonic speed. It determined the precise elevation and bearing for each of the 8 16-inch guns mounted in West Virginia's 4 turrets. What those Japanese sailors steaming north through the darkness did not know, could not know, was that they were already being watched, already being tracked, already being targeted by a fire control system so advanced that it rendered the night itself obsolete. They were steaming toward what naval historians would later call the last battleship duel in human history, and they were already doomed. The Japanese force was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force, the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. They had been ordered to penetrate Surigao Strait and attack the American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. It was a desperate mission, part of a larger, desperate plan called Operation Shogo, Victory Operation, the Imperial Japanese Navy's final attempt to destroy the American fleet and save the Philippines. Nishimura knew the odds were against him. He had received reconnaissance reports suggesting American forces were waiting at the northern exit of the strait. But his orders were explicit, and Nishimura was known throughout the fleet as a man who followed orders regardless of personal cost. What Nishimura did not know was that waiting for him in the darkness were 6 American battleships: West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. 5 of these ships had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 5 had felt Japanese bombs and torpedoes tear into their hulls. 5 had been raised from the mud, repaired, modernized, and returned to service with one purpose: vengeance. To understand what was about to happen in Surigao Strait, one must understand how naval warfare had been conducted for centuries. Since the age of sail, naval battles had been fought at visual, range. Captains maneuvered their ships to bring their guns to bear on an enemy they could see. Gunners aimed at targets visible through optical sights. Spotters watched for the splash of shells hitting the water, calling corrections. Up 200 yards, left 50. The entire system depended on human eyes observing the fall of shot and adjusting fire accordingly. By World War II, this system had been refined to extraordinary sophistication. Optical rangefinders on battleships measured up to 46 feet in length, using stereoscopic principles to determine the distance to a target with remarkable accuracy. Fire control computers, mechanical marvels of gears and cams, could calculate firing solutions for moving targets. But all of it still depended on one fundamental requirement. You had to be able to see your target. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in optical fire control. Their battleships mounted enormous rangefinders. Their crews trained relentlessly in night fighting, practicing under conditions of limited visibility. The Japanese doctrine emphasized closing to medium range around 20,000 yards, where their superior optical equipment and well-trained crews would have the advantage. They had used these tactics to devastating effect in the early war battles off Guadalcanal, where Japanese cruisers had shattered American forces in night surface actions. Japanese battleship gunnery officers learned to trust their instincts and their optical instruments. They practiced a technique called ladder firing, where successive salvos walked up and down the range until one straddled the target, with some shells falling short and others landing beyond. Once a straddle was achieved, all guns fired for effect at that range. It was an art form, requiring years of training and experience. The best Japanese gunners could achieve straddling salvos within minutes of opening fire. The Type 98 fire control system aboard Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, represented the best the Japanese Navy could produce. It included a 15-meter rangefinder atop the ship's distinctive pagoda mast, a mechanical ballistic computer called a Shigekiban, and a plotting table where 7 operators manually calculated firing solutions. The system worked. It had worked in every major surface action the Japanese Navy had fought, but it had one absolute requirement. The gunners had to see their target, or at least see the splashes their shells made when they hit the water. In the darkness of Surigao Strait, with visibility measured in dozens of yards rather than thousands, the Japanese fire control system was effectively blind. Nishimura's ships had radar Type 21 air search radar and Type 22 surface search radar, installed in 1943 and 1944. But Japanese naval radar in 1944 was years behind American technology. It could detect ships at ranges up to 20 miles in ideal conditions, but it could not provide the precise range, bearing, and target motion data necessary for fire control. Japanese radar could tell you something was out there. It could not tell you exactly where it was, how fast it was moving, or what course it was steering. For that, you needed optical rangefinders, and optical rangefinders needed light. The Americans had solved this problem in a way that would fundamentally change naval warfare. The Mark 8 fire control radar, installed on West Virginia, Tennessee, and California during their post-Pearl Harbor reconstructions, represented a quantum leap in targeting technology. It was a centimetric radar with a narrow beam width and small pulse width, capable of detecting range and bearing with extraordinary precision. More importantly, it provided a hard return, a sharp, clear image on the radar screen that remained distinct even when shell splashes cluttered the water around the target. The Mark 8 could spot 16-inch shell splashes out to 35,000 yards, allowing American gunners to observe the fall of their own shot in complete darkness. Combined with the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an automatic ballistic computer that calculated firing solutions continuously as the target moved, the system gave American battleships the ability to engage targets they could not see, at ranges where the enemy could not effectively return fire. It was, in every practical sense, the ability to fight blind against an opponent who was actually blind. The men who would use this technology were themselves survivors. West Virginia's crew included men who had been aboard on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. They remembered the torpedoes slamming into the port side, 5 hits in rapid succession that tore open the hull and flooded compartments before damage control parties could react. They remembered the ship settling into the mud as fires raged on the superstructure. They remembered shipmates who never made it off. The ship had been under water for months, her superstructure barely visible above the harbor's surface. When she was finally pumped out and refloated in May 1942, the interior was a tomb. Bodies were found at their battle stations, trapped when watertight doors sealed to prevent flooding. The ship was towed to dry dock, gutted, and rebuilt from the keel up. The reconstruction took over 2 years and cost $34 million more than it had cost to build her in the first place. When West Virginia emerged from Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in July 1944, she was a different ship. The old cage masts were gone, replaced by a streamlined tower that bristled with radar antennas. The anti-aircraft battery had been massively increased, with 40 quad-mounted 40mm Bofors guns and dozens of 20mm Oerlikon cannons. But the most significant change was invisible from the outside. The Mark 8 radar fire control system integrated with the Mark 8 Rangekeeper computer, giving the ship the ability to shoot accurately in conditions where Japanese optical fire control would be useless. California and Tennessee had undergone similar transformations. All 3 ships had been at Pearl Harbor. All 3 had been sunk or heavily damaged. All 3 had been resurrected with the most advanced fire control technology the United States could produce. Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania had also been modernized, though they retained older Mark III radar systems that lacked the precision of the Mark VIII. The man commanding this force was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, a soft-spoken officer with a cheerful disposition who had graduated from the Naval War College in 1927. Oldendorf understood what his ships could do. When he received orders on the afternoon of October 24th to prepare for a night engagement, he immediately recognized the tactical opportunity. The geography of Surigao Strait gave him every advantage. The strait is a narrow body of water, roughly 25 miles long and 10 miles wide at its northern end, bounded by the islands of Leyte to the west and Dinagat to the east. Any force approaching from the south would be funneled into this relatively confined space, their movements predictable, their room to maneuver limited. Oldendorf deployed his forces in layers, creating a gauntlet that any approaching enemy would have to run. First came the PT boats, small, fast patrol torpedo boats stationed at the southern entrance to the strait. Their job was to harass, illuminate, and report on the enemy's composition and course. Behind them, Oldendorf positioned 2 destroyer squadrons, ready to launch torpedo attacks from both flanks. Then came the cruisers, 8 heavy and light cruisers steaming back and forth across the northern end of the strait. And finally, forming the horizontal stroke of a classical T formation, came the 6 battleships. Patrolled slowly east and west across the strait's northern exit, their guns trained to the south, waiting. The T formation was a maneuver that had been taught at naval academies for generations. By positioning your battle line perpendicular to the enemy's approach, you could bring all your guns to bear, while the enemy, approaching in column, could only fire from their forward turrets. It was the dream scenario for any battleship commander, the kind of tactical advantage that decided fleet actions. Oldendorf had achieved it perfectly. The Japanese, approaching from the south in single column, would steam directly into the concentrated fire of the entire American battle line. Every American gun would bear. Most Japanese guns would be masked by their own ships ahead in column, but the decisive advantage was not the geometry of the formation, it was the radar. The Americans could see, the Japanese could not, and in naval warfare, the side that can see first usually wins. The Mark 8 fire. Control radar represented a technological breakthrough that would determine the outcome of the battle before it began. The system could detect the range, speed, and target angle of enemy ships with extraordinary precision and provided a much harder, clearer image on the radar screen than earlier models. USS Iowa Museum. Unlike the Mark III radar installed on 3 of the American battleships, the Mark 8 was less likely to have its screen cluttered by soft images such as shell splashes, allowing gunners to spot 16-inch shell impacts out to 35,000 yards, even in complete darkness. USS Iowa Museum. The system worked through a combination of centimetric radar and mechanical computing that would have seemed like magic to naval officers of an earlier generation. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an analog mechanical ballistic computer operated by one crewman, received manual inputs including powder charge, temperature, shell type, wind speed, and direction. USS Iowa Museum. But once these initial parameters were set, the machine took over. Using target data from the radar, the computer produced a firing solution, the correct position and elevation of the guns for hitting the target. As the range and bearing of the target changed, the radar detected these changes and fed them into the computer, which made corrections and produced new firing solutions continuously. USS Iowa Museum. Most remarkably, the Mark 8 Rangekeeper calculated the change of angle and range between the target's present position and the position where the target would be at the end of the projectile's flight. It could actually lead its target. USS Iowa Museum. The shells fired from West Virginia's 16-inch guns would travel for nearly a minute before reaching their target at maximum range, covering over 20 miles in a trajectory that peaked thousands of feet above the ocean surface. In that time, a ship moving at 20 knots would travel more than 600 yards. The Rangekeeper solved this problem automatically, continuously, with mechanical precision that no human calculator could match. The 3 battleships equipped with this system, West Virginia, Tennessee, and California, had all been at Pearl Harbor. All had been sunk or severely damaged. All had been rebuilt with one purpose in mind: to return to the Pacific and exact revenge. The reconstruction of West Virginia alone had taken over 2 years and cost $34 million. When she emerged from Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in July 1944, she displaced 33,590 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 16-inch, 45 caliber guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, capable of firing a 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectile to a maximum range of over 40,000 yards. The men who manned these systems had trained relentlessly. Seaman Borkowski, watching his radar screen in the plotting room, had practiced tracking targets for months. He knew how to distinguish genuine contacts from sea return and weather interference. He knew how to maintain a steady track even when targets maneuvered or when shell splashes temporarily obscured the radar return. Lieutenant Commander Vestal, the gunnery officer, had drilled his crews until they could load, aim, and fire with mechanical efficiency. The gun captains in each turret knew their equipment intimately, every gear, every hydraulic system, every electrical connection. But all this training and all this technology existed to serve one fundamental purpose: to put shells on target. And on this night, the target was approaching at 20 knots through the darkness, completely unaware that it was being tracked by a system against which it had no defense and no counter. Vice Admiral Nishimura's force consisted of 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. Yamashiro had been launched in 1915 and completed in 1917. She mounted 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, arranged with 2 turrets forward, 2 amidships, and 2 aft. The national interest, the amidships turrets, were the ship's greatest design flaw. They could not traverse to fire forward or aft, limiting the ship's broadside. In July 1943, a Type 21 air search radar was installed, and in August 1944, 2 Type 22 surface search radar units and 2 Type 13 early warning radar units were fitted. The national interest. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Japanese radar technology in 1944 lagged years behind American development. The Type 22 could detect ships at ranges up to 20 miles in ideal conditions, but it provided only approximate bearing and range data. It could not generate the precise targeting information necessary for fire control. 4. That Japanese gunners still relied on optical rangefinders, mounted high on the ship's distinctive pagoda mast rangefinders, that required visibility, that required light, that required conditions that simply did not exist in the pitch darkness of Surigao Strait at 3 in the morning. At 0302, Tennessee's search radar picked up the enemy ships at a range of 44,000 yards, nearly 25 miles. West Virginia's radar acquired them 14 minutes later at 42,000 yards. Combined fleet. In the plotting room, Seaman Borkowski watched the contacts materialize on his screen, growing sharper and larger with each sweep of the radar arm. The range closed steadily. 40,000 yards, 38,000, 35,000. The Japanese were steaming directly toward the American battle line, holding course and speed, apparently unaware of what awaited them. Before the battleships could engage, American destroyers had already struck, at approximately 0300. Fuso and 3 destroyers were hit by torpedoes launched by destroyer groups. Fuso broke in 2 but did not sink immediately. The national interest Yamashiro was also hit by 1 or 2 torpedoes around 0311, suffering damage that temporarily slowed the ship, gave her a list to port, and forced the flooding of the magazines for the 2 aft turrets. The national interest. 2 Japanese destroyers sank immediately. A third, crippled, limped away into the darkness. But Nishimura pressed on. He had his orders. He knew American forces waited ahead. He continued north toward his objective, toward Leyte Gulf, toward the mission he had been assigned regardless of cost. Yamashiro, damaged but still capable of fighting, led what remained of his force toward the northern exit of the strait. Behind him, Fuso burned, her hull broken, settling slowly into the water. In the American battle line, Admiral Oldendorf waited. His 6 battleships steamed slowly, east and west across the northern end of the strait, their guns trained to the south. The cruisers had already opened fire, their 6-inch and 8-inch guns sending salvo after salvo toward the approaching Japanese ships. Gun flashes lit the horizon. The sound of heavy naval gunfire rolled across the water. And still Nishimura came on. Oldendorf gave the order to open fire at 0351. Combined fleet. At 0352, West Virginia fired her 8 16-inch guns at a range of 22,800 yards, just under 13 miles. Wikipedia Angel Fire. The plotting room had achieved a firing solution minutes earlier. West Virginia had a firing solution at 30,000 yards but held fire, waiting for the range to close, waiting for the optimal moment. Ancient war history. When the order came, the ship's main battery erupted. 8 16-inch guns fired simultaneously, the massive recoil shoving the 33,000-ton ship sideways in the potas, water. The sound was not a bang but a deep, physical concussion that could be felt throughout the entire vessel. Flames shot from the barrel ends. The 1-ton armor-piercing projectiles arced upward into the darkness, their trajectories calculated by the rangekeeper, their course guided by mathematics and mechanical precision. 50 seconds later, the shells arrived. West Virginia probably hit Yamashiro on her bridge with her first salvo. Combined Fleet Angel fire. The ship's action report would later note, the first salvo was a straddle with numerous hits on which a no-change spot was made and applied. Of the 13 full salvos fired, all were straddles. Angel fire. A straddle meant that shells fell both short and beyond the target, the ideal pattern for naval gunnery, indicating the range was exactly correct. Tennessee and California opened fire at 0354, concentrating their fire on Yamashiro, combined fleet. Their 14-inch guns added to the deluge of steel, falling on the Japanese battleship. Maryland, with an older Mark III radar, had difficulty acquiring targets in the darkness and the confusion of shell splashes. But West Virginia, Tennessee, and California maintained steady, accurate fire, their Mark VIII radars cutting through the darkness, their rangekeepers calculating continuously, their crews loading and firing with practiced efficiency. On Yamashiro's bridge, Vice Admiral Nishimura faced a situation no Japanese naval officer had trained for. His ships were being hit by accurate heavy gunfire from an enemy he could not see, could not range, could not effectively return fire against. His optical rangefinders showed only darkness. His radar provided only approximate bearing data, insufficient for fire control. He could see the muzzle flashes of American guns on the northern horizon, brief orange blooms in the night, but the distance was too great, the visibility too poor, his fire control systems too dependent on optical ranging that simply did not function in these conditions. Yamashiro's secondary battery fired back, her 6-inch guns sending shells toward the American line, but without effective fire control, the shots fell uselessly into the sea. Her main battery, what remained operational after the torpedo damage, attempted to engage, but her gunners were firing blind, hoping for lucky hits against an enemy they could barely detect. West Virginia's crew observed 3 pronounced flare-ups on the target at the splash time of their first, second, and 6th salvos, visual confirmation of major hits. Angel fire. Inside Yamashiro, those hits meant catastrophe. 16-inch armor-piercing shells weighing nearly 1.5 tons each, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, struck the battleship's superstructure and hull. Some penetrated deep into the ship before detonating, their explosive charges tearing apart compartments, igniting fires, killing crew members. Others struck the pagoda mast, the distinctive multi-story tower that housed the ship's command spaces and fire control stations. A crew member aboard West Virginia, watching from the deck, later recalled seeing the projectiles arc upward into the night sky, a burning material trailing behind them for some distance. The huge ship moved sideways in the water 4 feet from the recoil of those rifles. If you were anywhere near guns of this size being fired, the sound was deafening, not a bang but a loud whoom, and your clothing would whip in the wind created as the shells left the barrel ends. Your face and bare arms would feel the heat of the flames spouting from those barrels. The American cruisers continued their fire, adding 6-inch and 8-inch shells to the deluge. Japanese ships were being hit from multiple directions simultaneously. At approximately 0400, Mogami and then Yamashiro turned to retreat, both burning. Combined fleet, the destroyer Shigure, which had not suffered serious damage, fled with them. Nishimura's bold attempt to penetrate the strait had failed. His force was destroyed. Fuso was already gone, her broken hull slipping beneath the water. The destroyers were sinking or had sunk. Only Yamashiro, Mogami, and Shigure remained, all damaged, all retreating south through the darkness they had entered with such confidence hours before. Shortly after 0400, Oldendorf ordered his battleships to make a 150-degree turn. West Virginia led the other battleships on the new course, which ran parallel to Yamashiro's line of retreat. Combined fleet. The American battle line was following, maintaining fire, pursuing the wounded Japanese ships as they attempted to escape. But confusion aboard California led her to fall out of position, masking the rest of the battleships and forcing them to cease firing to avoid hitting her. Combined fleet. It did not matter. The damage was done. Around 0400, 4 torpedoes hit Yamashiro, possibly from the destroyer Newcomb. The stricken battleship went dead in the water, keeling over to port. Fires amidships silhouetted the pagoda superstructure in a lurid glow as it heeled over like a collapsing sandcastle. Wikipedia. On the bridge, the skipper, Rear Admiral Katsukiyo Shinoda, calmly passed the word to abandon ship. He and Nishimura remained on their bridges. Within 2 to 5 minutes, the blazing dreadnought keeled over and capsized. Nishimura, his staff of 20 officers, Shinoda, and nearly all of Yamashiro's crew of 1,636 officers and men went to the bottom of Surigao Strait. Wikipedia. While a large number of sailors survived the sinking, only 10 crew members from Yamashiro returned to Japan, 2 warrant officers and 8 petty officers. The National Interest Naval Encyclopedia. The same number survived from Fuso. Out of more than 3,000 men who had sailed north through the strait hours before, 20 returned home. The rest died in the darkness, drowned in the warm waters of the Philippine Sea, trapped in sinking ships, burned in fires ignited by American shells, killed by the overwhelming firepower of an enemy they never saw. West Virginia fired 16 salvos at the Japanese ships in the course of the action. Combined fleet. A total of 89 armor-piercing and 4 high-capacity projectiles were fired. Angel fire. The official count was that West Virginia sent 93 armor-piercing, 1-ton projectiles and scored major hits on the targets of the radar screen. U.S. Naval Institute. A crew member later recalled, "I do not recall seeing any return enemy fire. Certainly none was directed at us." Another noted, "The major radar blip, the one we fired on first, had disappeared completely from the radar screen. This happened in the first 19 minutes. It was later found to have been the battleship Yamashiro. This proved to be the last ever battle between battleships. Combined fleet never, again, would capital ships of the line engage each other in direct combat. The age of the battleship, which had begun with Dreadnought in 1906, ended in Surigao Strait in the early morning darkness of October 25, 1944. And it ended not with a glorious duel between equals, but with a technological mismatch so complete that one side fought blind, while the other saw with perfect clarity through the darkness. After the Battle of Surigao Strait, West Virginia remained in the Philippines to support troops fighting during the Battle of Leyte in 1944. She then supported the invasion of Lingayen Gulf in early 1945. The ship also took part in the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa later that year, providing extensive fire support to ground forces invading those islands. USS Iowa History. Battleship USS Iowa Museum +2. After spending years in dry docks and shipyards, West Virginia put in 223 days in battle, where she shot down 8 would-be kamikazes and assisted with 12 others. Wikipedia. On April 1, 1945, while off Okinawa, she was hit by a Japanese kamikaze plane, but was able to remain in action, continuing her bombardment duties there into June. Iowa, PBS Wikipedia. The kamikaze struck her superstructure, killing 4 sailors and wounding 7 more. But the ship that had once been left for dead at Pearl Harbor, that had sat in the mud with her decks awash, absorbed this final blow and continued fighting. The irony was profound. The same ship that Japanese aircraft had crippled in December 1941 with torpedoes and bombs now brushed off a suicide attack as if it were merely an inconvenience. The crew repaired the damage, buried their dead, and returned to their bombardment stations. They fired their 16-inch guns in support of Marines fighting ashore, each shell weighing nearly 1.5 tons, each impact devastating Japanese defensive positions. The ship that had been written off as a total loss had become an instrument of revenge, methodical and unstoppable. When news of the Japanese surrender reached the officers and crew of West Virginia, the battleship was at Okinawa. Ordered to sail for Tokyo Bay, she arrived there on August 31st. West Virginia was the largest ship of the United States Navy present at both Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese surrender ceremonies on September 2nd, 1945. Naval History and Heritage Command. The symbolism was almost too perfect to be real. The battleship that had been among the most heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor, that had required over 2 years of reconstruction and $34 million in repairs, that had been transformed from a World War I-era design into a modern warship equipped with the most advanced radar fire control system in the world, that ship witnessed both the beginning and the end of America's ASO, war with Japan. She had been present at the moment of greatest humiliation and at the moment of final victory. For the crew, sailing into Tokyo Bay must have felt like closing a circle. Many of them had not been aboard on December 7th, 1941. They had joined after the reconstruction, after the ship had been raised and rebuilt. But they knew the history. They knew what had happened in Pearl Harbor. They knew about the men who had died trapped in compartments below the waterline, about the bodies that had been found when the ship was pumped out months after the attack. They knew that Japanese torpedoes had torn open the port side, that Japanese bombs had set fires on the superstructure, that the ship had settled into the mud with only her upper works visible above the water. And now they were in Tokyo Bay, watching Japanese officials board the battleship Missouri to sign surrender documents. The war was over. Japan had lost, and West Virginia, risen from the dead, had played her part in that victory. The technical superiority demonstrated at Surigao Strait, the ability to engage targets beyond visual range using radar fire control, represented more than just a tactical advantage in a single battle. It represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, the end of one era and the beginning of another. At maximum battle range of about 28,000 yards, a 16-inch shell could take 40 seconds to reach the target, and a target steaming at 25 knots would have moved 560 yards while the shell was in flight nearly twice the length of an Iowa-class battleship. Combined fleet, solving this problem optically, in darkness, was impossible. Solving it with radar and mechanical computers was not just possible, but routine for ships equipped with the Mark 8 system. Only with the advent of 10-centimeter and later 3-centimeter wavelength radar sets was true blind-fire radar fire control achievable, wherein the firing ship need never come into visual range of the opposing vessel. The Germans, Japanese, and Italians never developed sets of this capability. The national interest American vessels, particularly Iowa and South Dakota class battleships, would enjoy an enormous advantage in gunfire control over their adversaries, with the ability to lob shells over the visual horizon and perform better in complete darkness or adverse weather conditions. The national interest. The Japanese had attempted to compensate for their technological disadvantage through superior training and doctrine. They emphasized night fighting. They practiced engaging targets at medium ranges, where their excellent optical equipment would provide an advantage. In contrast to the United States radar-aided system, the Japanese relied on averaging optical rangefinders, lacked gyroscopes to sense the horizon, and required manual handling of follow-ups on their fire control equipment as well as the guns themselves. The national interest. This manual system worked well enough against opponents who lacked radar or in conditions where visibility allowed optical ranging. But against an enemy who could see in the dark, who could track targets with mechanical precision, who could maintain fire control solutions, even while maneuvering at high speed against that enemy, Japanese optical superiority meant nothing. The performance of American analog computers was impressive. The battleship USS North Carolina, during a 1945 test, was able to maintain an accurate firing solution on a target during a series of high-speed turns. It was a major advantage for a warship to be able to maneuver while engaging a target. Naval Encyclopedia. In practical terms, American vessels could keep a solution on a target even when performing radical maneuvers. In 1945, North Carolina maintained a constant solution even when performing back-to-back high-speed 450-degree turns, followed by back-to-back 100-degree turns. This gave United States battleships a major tactical advantage in that they could both shoot and maneuver, whereas their opponents could only do one or the other. The national interest, the implications extended beyond individual ship capabilities. Improvements in technology rendered World War II battleship gunnery dramatically more effective than that achievable during the 20s and 30s. The extensive use of radar, virtually unknown between the wars, completely transformed the surface and aerial fire control problem, both in daylight and in darkness. Wikipedia. The Mark 8 fire control radar could spot 16-inch splashes out to about 20,000 yards, and the improved Mark 8 Modification 3 could reliably spot 14-inch and 16-inch fire out to at least 35,000 yards. Wikipedia. This meant that American battleships could observe the fall of their own shells in conditions where Japanese ships were effectively blind. They could adjust fire based on radar observation of shell splashes, refining their aim continuously even when the target was invisible to optical instruments. The feedback loop that made accurate naval gunnery possible, observe, adjust, fire again, functioned perfectly for American ships in conditions where Japanese ships could not observe anything at all. The Battle of Surigao Strait demonstrated this advantage in the most decisive way possible. Japanese battleships approaching through the darkness had no idea they were being tracked until American shells began falling on them. They attempted to return fire but had no effective way to aim. Their optical rangefinders showed only blackness. Their radar provided approximate bearing data, but lacked the precision necessary for fire control. They fired toward the muzzle flashes of American guns on the northern horizon, hoping for lucky hits that never came. Both Washington at the naval battle of Guadalcanal and West Virginia at Surigao Strait straddled their targets with their first salvos. Combined fleet. This was not luck. This was the result of superior fire control technology integrated with trained crews and reliable equipment. The first salvo achieving a straddle shells falling both short and beyond the target meant the range was exactly correct. Subsequent salvos simply maintained that range while adjusting for any changes in target course or speed. The radar saw everything. The rangekeeper calculated continuously. The guns fired with mechanical precision. The Japanese had entered the battle confident in their training and their tradition. They left the battle, those few who survived, knowing that training and tradition meant nothing against an enemy who possessed overwhelming technological superiority in the one area that mattered most: the ability to see and accurately engage targets in conditions where the enemy was blind. After Japan's capitulation, West Virginia supported the occupation effort until mid-September. She participated in Operation Magic Carpet during the last part of 1945, bringing home veterans of the Pacific War. Inactive after early 1946, she was decommissioned in January 1947. USS Iowa History. Battleship, USS Iowa Museum +2. Following 12 years in the Pacific Reserve Fleet, USS West Virginia was sold for scrapping in August 1959. Iowa PBS Wikipedia. The ship that had witnessed both Pearl Harbor and the Japanese surrender, that had been raised from the mud and transformed into the most technologically advanced battleship in the Pacific Fleet, ended her life in a scrapyard. Her guns were cut up, her armor was melted down, her superstructure, which had bristled with radar antennas and fire control equipment, was dismantled piece by piece. Nothing physical remains of West Virginia today except photographs, documents, and the memories of the men who served aboard her. But what she represented, what Surigao Strait represented, survived in the institutional memory of naval warfare. The battle proved conclusively that radar fire control had rendered optical gunnery obsolete for long-range engagements in limited visibility. It proved that American investment in radar technology, in analog computing, in the integration of sensors and weapons systems, had created a decisive advantage over opponents who relied on older methods. It proved that in modern industrial warfare, technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage, tactical skill, and even the courage of well-trained crews. Vice Admiral Nishimura died on the bridge of Yamashiro, going down with his flagship, following the samurai tradition of a commander sharing the fate of his men. His courage was unquestionable. His devotion to duty was absolute. But courage and devotion could not compensate for fighting with fire control systems that belonged to an earlier generation of naval warfare. The effectiveness of radar fire control was demonstrated in November 1942 at the Third Battle of Salvo Island, when USS Washington engaged the Japanese battleship Kirishima at a range of 8,400 yards at night. Kirishima was set aflame, suffered a number of explosions, and was scuttled by her crew. She had been hit by at least 9 16-inch rounds, out of 75, fired a 12% hit rate. Naval Encyclopedia Surigao Strait repeated this pattern on a larger scale. American battleships achieved hit rates that would have been impossible using optical fire control in complete darkness. They engaged at ranges where Japanese optical equipment was useless. They maneuvered while maintaining accurate fire. They demonstrated every advantage that radar and modern fire control computers provided. The historical irony at the heart of this story is simple but profound. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor to cripple the American Pacific Fleet, to buy time, for the empire to consolidate its conquests across Asia and the Pacific. The attack succeeded tactically. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans died. The photographs of burning ships and black smoke rising over Pearl Harbor shocked the nation and galvanized public opinion for war. But strategically, the attack accomplished the opposite of what Japan intended. It brought the United States fully into the war with a determination to win at any cost. It forced the American Navy to rebuild and modernize its battle fleet, incorporating the most advanced technology available. And it created a desire for revenge that would drive American forces across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. West Virginia embodied that transformation. Sunk at Pearl Harbor, she was raised, rebuilt, and returned to service as a weapon more capable than she had been when first commissioned in 1923. The reconstruction gave her radar fire control that made her deadlier in the dark than she had ever been in daylight. The modernization gave her anti-aircraft weapons that could defend against the very type of air attacks that had sunk her. The ship that Japan had destroyed came back stronger, more advanced, more dangerous. At Surigao Strait, 3 ships that had been at Pearl Harbor, West Virginia, Tennessee, and California led the American battle line. All 3 had been sunk or heavily damaged. All 3 had been rebuilt with Mark 8 radar fire control. And all 3 opened fire on Japanese battleships in the darkness, achieving straddling salvos, scoring multiple hits, helping to sink Yamashiro and devastate Nishimura's force. The symmetry was almost poetic. The ships Japan had destroyed at the beginning of the war returned to destroy Japanese ships at the end. But this was not poetry. This was material reality. This was industrial capacity converted into military power. This was technology integrated into weapons systems. This was trained crews using sophisticated equipment to achieve results that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. The Battle of Surigao Strait was not won by courage or fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, though all of those were present. It was won by radar, by analog computers, by the ability to see in the dark and hit what you could see. It was won before it began, because one side possessed technology the other side could not match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.